thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. I received a good question, or a couple questions, from a listener, Jared, and he said this. I thought I would respond to this. He said, I had a few questions from reading Matthew's Gospel, and I was hoping to get some insight from you. Matthew claims a, quote, fulfilled prophecy in 26:55 and 56, and this is what it says. At that time, Jesus said to the crowd, Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. End quote from Matthew 26:56. Then Jared says, but he doesn't say that what prophecy he's referring to, and I couldn't find anything similar in the Old Testament. Is it a prophecy that didn't make it into the scripture, or did I miss it? That made me laugh because that's a good question. I mean, these are good. You didn't miss it. I'll come back to that in just a second. Was Jesus or Matthew just wrong? This is what Jared asks. Was Jesus or Matthew just wrong? Then he goes on and says, Matthew 27:9 claims a fulfilled prophecy from Jeremiah, but the passage he quotes, or paraphrases, is actually seems to be from Zechariah 11:12-13, which also doesn't seem to be a messianic prophecy. I've read different explanations about what happened, but was curious about your reflections on it. And I'll just finish this up and I'll come back to this. Finally, back in chapter 2, 17-18, Matthew claims Herod's slaughter of the innocents is a fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:15, which reads as follows. This is what the Lord says. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because her children are no more. End quote from Matthew 2:18. This didn't seem like a prophecy, nor did it sound like it had anything to do with Herod, but about the Babylonian captivity. I feel like I'm missing something that is pretty obvious, but I'm not sure what it is. I feel like a lot of what I read in the Gospels that are fulfillment of prophecy aren't really prophecies about the Messiah. Anyway, if you can help, I would appreciate it. Thanks. These are great questions, Jared. These are good questions. And I have thought about these questions a good bit, and how to say it in certainly a kind way. And that is the first thing, and that is these are good questions, and they're common questions. They're so common. This is really standard stuff that we covered in Intro to New Testament. Most Intro to New Testament classes, you'll talk a lot about what do we do with fulfilled prophecy. Now, because it's introductory doesn't mean I'm slamming you. I'm saying it's such a good common question that they deal with it right off the bat. And I'm not exactly sure which order in which to take these, but you're not missing something. These are genuinely good questions that scholars give various opinions on, and you get to make up your mind. But before I reflect on fulfilled prophecy, you might say in general, I want to cover some of these very specifically that you mentioned, if that's all right. And the first one, I'll just go in order which you did, and that is in chapter 26 and 56, when you said that this is to fulfill a prophecy, and you said you couldn't find anything where there's prophecy, and you're right. I mean, you're right. I think it's safe to say that most scholars think that with these kinds of texts, like in Matthew 26:56, that the scriptures of the prophets would be fulfilled, and when there's no reference, they typically refer to an early church narrative of texts. You might say almost a list. I say a narrative, but it is like a narrative of a conglomeration of what we call testimonia, or a list of text that the earliest Jewish Christians had from the Old Testament, very, very particularly from the book of Isaiah, that explained why Jesus had to suffer, why he had to suffer. And so it's very common in these kinds of texts to presume that what is in the background are what are known as the suffering servant songs in Isaiah 51 and 53, 54. There's a few texts. If you haven't read them, if you read them, if you grew up in church at all, they're going to sound familiar. The Messiah, the musical that came out centuries ago, it's based on a lot of these texts. But he was wounded for our transgressions, by his stripes we have been healed. That's all from Isaiah. What's interesting is those texts aren't quoted often in the Gospels, but they are quoted sometimes, and they're certainly alluded to. But to save you a lot of scholarship, because there are an enormous amount of books and articles and literature written on this exact topic, it's safe to say that, again, one more time, that the vast majority of New Testament specialists would concur that what the gospel writers have in mind in the background are scriptures from the prophets, particularly from Isaiah, and particularly from a few chapters of Isaiah, which presage or they hint at what this messianic figure is going to go through. So in Matthew 26, and this is all through Matthew, we see in Matthew 26, it fits it. I mean, it does fit the idea that in this particular context, Jesus is being arrested and he's going to be hurt. The fact is, I would say, and most scholars do, that what Matthew means here is that this is exactly what should you expect from God's anointed one, that he's going to be hurt by the people he's come to save. And that fits Matthew's theme very well. Matthew deliberately has several themes, people argue, but he does. And one, of course, is that his ministry is fulfilling various Old Testament texts. And I'll talk more about that. What does it mean to be fulfilling? But that's general assumption. But Matthew almost certainly gets that from Mark, and maybe just the early church community. It's difficult to know where he got it from, but we know it's in Mark. If there's one prophet that the gospel writers love the most, it is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, Isaiah. And these kind of texts to which they go. Not only the gospel writers love Isaiah, but Paul likes Isaiah. And you have these kinds of text alluded to in other texts. But the gospel writers certainly think Isaiah and those passages are apparently the place the earliest Jewish Christians went to try to interpret the significance of the suffering and death of Jesus. That was their textbook. That was their, if I can say the word, manual. It was the source from their way of trying to make sense of all this stuff. So if that is true, it would mean Matthew's churches to whom he wrote would have understood that. So you have explicit references and almost certainly implicit references, and he doesn't cite them all the time. When it's explicit, he cites it. Otherwise, he doesn't, and that's the case. So you're not missing anything, and that's it. I do find that very convincing. Do we know for sure what he has in mind? Absolutely not. Of course not, because he doesn't cite it. We don't know exactly what he has in mind, but it does. It is one of Matthew's patterns to do that. And Matthew, of all the four Gospels, Matthew says that expression, "Thus was written," or "written to be fulfilled," the most. I mean, he says it. I can't remember. I used to know there's an exact number. It's a lot. Matthew is very concerned with joining together Israel's story, or various portions of their story, with the Jesus story. Hey, let me take a quick break. Please listen carefully to these quick announcements. I'll be right back.
Do you know of any skeptics in your family, at work, or among your friends? Do you struggle with questions concerning the existence of God or the truth claims of Christianity? Has a skeptic ever challenged you with a difficult question concerning your faith? Then you need to buy Dr. Pendergrass's book, A Skeptic Challenges a Christian, on Amazon.com. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle or in audiobook form to listen to. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian is written unlike any other book. It's not boring and full of technical jargon. It reads like you're sitting down having a conversation. As one reviewer said, "As a college student, I absolutely love this book. Dr. Pendergrass knows how to effectively answer a lot of the questions that my friends at school ask about my faith. This book is a great resource for theological debates and for my own personal growth. The arguments are clear and understandable. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who has questions about Christianity, wants to learn how to defend their faith, or even just wants a good read. Great book." Find out why it has a perfect 5-star rating on Amazon.com. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. Buy your copies today. Ever wonder what God wants you to do with your money? Should I give it all away or save? What did the early church do with their money? In Dr. Pendergrass's book, Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money, you'll get 4 short, powerful lessons on what to do with money based on some key texts from the New Testament. This is a wonderful guide for study and reflection. It even comes with reflection questions that are perfect for small group discussions. Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money. Buy your copies today on Amazon.com. Do you like receiving a glimpse of the kingdom for free? Would you like to support what God is doing through these resources? Then please consider donating to David Pendergrass Ministries, Inc. today at davidpendergrass.com. There, you can also sign up to receive Dr. Pendergrass's free blog on a wide range of theological, biblical, and relationship issues. That's davidpendergrass.com.
Thank you for listening. Let's pick back up where we left off. The other example given, Matthew 27:9, about a chapter later, where Matthew says explicitly that this is from Jeremiah. I mean, he says explicitly, just remind the audience if you haven't read this in a while. And this section, verses 3 to 10, basically, is when it's Matthew's version of Judas's suicide, his version of it, which is, different elsewhere. It's not radically different, but it is different. But in this context, they take this blood money, but the Pharisees, chief priests rather, can't accept it, so they go and buy the potter's field. It's for foreigners. That's what it says in verse 7. And then verse 8, it says, for that reason the field has been called the field of blood to this day. And then this was what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took 30 silver coins, the price of the one whose price had been set for the people of Israel, and they gave him for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. Now, that's almost a direct quote, not from Jeremiah, but from Zechariah. And it is. It's almost a direct quote from Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 to 13. There have been numerous responses to this in scholarship for a long time. I mean, there's all kinds of options. You can say Matthew just got it wrong. Matthew meant Zechariah when he said Jeremiah. That's just a possibility. If you believe that God is the author of Scripture, then that is not a possibility. It is an impossibility, they would say, because God can't get it wrong. So it must mean something else. There must be another explanation besides Matthew just got it wrong. Anyway, but I don't hold the assumption God wrote the Bible. I don't hold the assumption, but I'm open to it, completely open. So in my view, it's in the realm of possibility that Matthew just got his wrong book. And he's going by memory, and I don't care. I don't give a rip if he got a citation wrong. I don't care. But that's one option. The other option, of course, is that he said Jeremiah because that's who he's trying to evoke. And Jeremiah, at the time period, probably was considered a greater prophet, that is just a little more important, like an Isaiah. And they quoted the big dogs more than the minor dogs. And that's possible. It's possible if you find that convincing. But you would just... For me, to find that persuasive, I would need a lot more evidence that's how Jews did it. But I'm saying I don't find that much evidence for such a phenomenon, but it is possible. It's also possible that there are texts, for example, in Jeremiah, which speaks about this kind of thing, if that makes sense. There are texts which speak about, for example, in Jeremiah 18:2-6, the prophet visits a potter. And so in Matthew, he talks about a potter's field. So in Jeremiah 18:2-6, there is a potter. Then later on in Jeremiah 32:6-15, he buys a field. And so some have argued, W.D. Davies, D.C. Allison, they've argued that that it's to signal the whole theme that's in Jeremiah. But what comes to mind is an exact quote from Zechariah. And anyway, the point is you can kind of get around it depending on what your presuppositions are. If it's a bothersome text to you, then you're going to say, oh, he didn't really mean Jeremiah. He did mean Jeremiah, but he just ended up, his citation sounded more like Zechariah or something. There you go. But I'm sorry. I wish I had more definitive. I guess if my gut reaction is he just miscited the wrong prophet, and that makes a lot of sense to me. We know for a fact that the ancient Jews respected Scripture a whole lot, but the actual manuscripts themselves were quite expensive, and it's not like you went to the local Sanhedrin, the synagogue down the street and grabbed all the scrolls of the prophets. They didn't own all of them, at least for the evidence that we have. They would have shared them. They might have had a couple really biggies, like a scroll of Genesis, or maybe the Torah, or maybe from one of the prophets. But almost certainly they did not possess a library of all of the books we call the Old Testament. And so it's very likely that all the gospel writers and all the earliest Jewish Christians just heard these texts in the synagogue over and over and over and over, and sometimes they got their citation incorrect. I find that most persuasive. And if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Okay. Again, since I just don't really care, I don't really care if I'm wrong either, because I just don't see the difference it makes. But back to your exact point, okay, let's say it's from Zechariah. Even if it's from Zechariah, is that prophetic? Does that mean that it is prophetic when he's talking about it in the text as Matthew meant? So let's say it is Zechariah. Let's say it's Jeremiah. I mean, it doesn't matter which text it is, because it seems to me, because Matthew's using the text, wherever whence it comes, to say this is to fulfill what the prophet said. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but because I'm going to have one basic thing to say about all these texts. So your question is that a messianic prophecy? And my response is no, but I'll come back to that in just a second. And then you go back to chapter 2, and you says Matthew talks about the Herod slaughtering the innocents, and you're exactly right. He does do that, and he talks about how this is to fulfill the Jeremiah 31:15. See, again, Matthew likes Jeremiah and Isaiah, but and that the comforting, the voice heard in Ramah. Now, Ramah is a town not too far from Jerusalem, and that where Rachel is weeping. Now, in Jeremiah chapter 31, you're right. It is about the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah is poetically, metaphorically saying that Rachel is weeping for her children. Well, that's a metaphor because Rachel had been dead for a long time. In fact, she wasn't buried too far outside of Jerusalem. It's Jeremiah's way of saying that God is very sad, or his people are very sad for their being exiled. The Babylonian people are exiled. So God's people, rather, are very sad, and it's so bad. Rachel in her tomb is weeping, and it's very, very sad about that. Now, did that exact text about her weeping in Jeremiah 31 have anything to do with quote-unquote prophecy? On the surface level, the answer is absolutely not. But on Matthew's narratival level, absolutely it does, because Matthew, in Matthew chapter 2, and all through the gospel, Matthew has, certainly in the early couple chapters of Matthew, most scholars concur that Matthew is deliberately setting up an exile motif, and that Jesus is a representative for Israel. And there's a lot of details here, but I'll just give you the synopsis. But if you look at it carefully, you'll see how Matthew weaves in texts which sound like Israel, who have been kicked out. So Jesus gets kicked out of the Israel. So after he can't stay there because they're going to be killed. Remember this, Herod, he's going to slaughter, so he goes down to Egypt. Well, that's like the ancient Israelites, and he's warned in a dream. Then he flees back out, and it's like he's coming out of the Exodus. But when he goes there, he's like the people of Israel because he comes through the water, and at his baptism, he gets tempted, just like the ancient Israelites were tempted when they were in the wilderness. In fact, the temptations of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4 are very similar to 3 particular temptations the Israelites went through, but the ancient Israelites failed. But there's tension there because you don't know if Jesus is going to fail. At least not in the narrative, you don't know. And then he succeeds. And Matthew presents Jesus as the ideal Israelite who represents Israel. And so much so, by the end of the gospel, he's this ideal Israelite, like in Isaiah 51, 53, 54, the suffering servant, who is a composite, you might say, of Israel itself, upon whom the sufferings of that due him because of the sin of Israel are cast upon him, and then of course they are healed from that. So all through Matthew, I see this, and many scholars do, you see a theme where Jesus represents this composite ideal figure of Israel himself. And that fits Matthew chapter 2 and Jeremiah 31:15 really well, because that's what's going on in Jeremiah 31. What's going on in Jeremiah 31 is the Babylon exile. And they're very sad that it's as bad as it's gotten. But it leads to restoration. By the end of Jeremiah, you see that it leads to restoration. What Matthew's saying, it's like that. Matthew's saying it is like that now. It's like that now. The fact is, there's weeping because God's people are being, just like in Jeremiah and Babylonian captivity, people have been punished and been exiled, and it stinks for them. The death is threatened, and it seems like they're being kicked out, and God's abandoned them. It's like that with Jesus. That Jesus himself, the Messiah, also had to go through suffering. So it sure seems to be to me that Matthew is just making an analogy, and and I'll talk more about that in a second as well. Sorry about that, but I'm almost there. So when you say I think I'm missing something, and maybe and so forth, you see that in the Gospels a lot of fulfillment of prophecy. I agree with you. And so here's the big Sorry, I've been waiting to the end. Here's the end. My response is, you're exactly right. That it seems to me you are right that when you read these texts at quote unquote surface level, these are not fulfillments of a quote prophecy. In an intro to New Testament, you'll learn this if you ever took a class. They would say, what most scholars say is, well, it's what we call in the Latin expression sensus plenior, that is the fuller sense. The fuller sense. And let me explain that, unpack a little bit. Jews, when you read the New Testament carefully, and you read Jewish literature carefully, well, of course, the Gospels are Jewish literature. I mean, they believe Jesus is the Messiah, but they're Jewish. When you read the Gospels and you read Paul's letters and you read the rabbinic material, the Talmud, the Mishnah, when you read the Targums, when you read other biblical commentaries Jews wrote, you see a fairly common pattern of belief about the text, what we might call Old Testament. And I'll put that in quotation marks in the air because it wasn't formed at this time. But they're formative documents, Torah, prophets, Psalms, Proverbs, that eventually became what we call the Old Testament. These kinds of formative texts, which were formative texts in this first couple centuries, we know that because they cite them often. Not every single text often, but several texts often. They're very formative. The Jews had no problem thinking these formative texts could be used to interpret whatever they were going through right then. I mean, that was it. They used those texts as an interpretive lens through which to see what they're going through. They did. So imagine if there's a really bad thunderstorm and they go, why was that thunderstorm so bad? What happened? They will go to what we would call their Bible and say, oh, it's because, just like it says in Exodus 26:14, what I'm making up a verse, the storm will come and hurt us. My baby died. How do I make sense of that? Well, that's like the text that says, so they went to the Old Testament that they considered sacred and special and unique as God revealing himself to their ancient ancestors, and they used it as a guidebook to say, well, if it made sense to them back then, surely it can make sense to us now, and he can be speaking to us now to this current situation. Which means they had no problem doing what scholarship today, I mean, they'll get you a bad grade on a test and a paper, and that is ripping things out of context. Because they don't care about the context. And that's overwhelmingly obvious when you read Jewish literature. They do not care about context. With a rare exception, they do not give a rip. I mean, they don't give a rip. Words, phrases, sentences, paragraphs, they don't care. It's like every single word is independently authoritative, like a brick that you can just take away, like a Lego brick, and you just take away, I'll put it over here, I'll put it over here. And they don't have a problem with that. They don't. It's all through the ancient world. Jews did that. Early Christians did the same thing. So Jewish and Gentile Christians ended up doing a very similar thing. And we can see this as early as the end of the close of the first century, beginning of the second, letter of Barnabas. And you have these documents where these earliest Gentile Christians then go to their Old Testament and then start radically changing the definition and, the usages of these texts. They just didn't have a problem with it at all. And this became the way to do it in the late antiquity. So the early church fathers did the same thing. They ripped things out of context all the time. All the time. And that's my first response is what you've noticed here, what's come. It's a good astute observation. And that is, you have put your finger on a common Jewish way of interpreting the text. Now they have other ways of doing it. And in scholarship, we break these down, because Jews typically follow certain patterns of how they did it, of how and when they use certain verses. For example, one of the very common ways Jews like to do this, we see this in Paul's letters all the time. He likes to cite Old Testament verses that have the same word, and he'll put them back to back to back. He does this in Romans several times. So if any kind of word like the word grace pops in his mind, or rock, or Billy, or whatever, he'll cite, it's like this, and this. And those verses are all ripped out of context, but has the same word, and he'll use it. Sometimes another one called kalomor. I remember the exact Hebrew expression. It means from the lesser to the greater. And this is common for Paul as well, and sometimes in Gospels, but certainly in Paul's letters, where it's a Jewish way of interpreting. You take Old Testament text and go, if he did it back here, how much more will he do it through Christ? It's like that in Romans 5 when he says, if sin entered the world through Adam, how much more life and righteousness come in through Jesus? And he'll cite verses that make his point for him. So we see some patterns of how Jews used their Old Testament, their Bible, to interpret their current context. Now, they weren't fully systematic, but they did have some patterns. They did have patterns. But it's all predicated on the assumption, I've already said, the predicated on the assumption that you can do that. It's fine to do that. Because we're trying to interpret our now. How do I interpret our now? I do it by going back to the Old Testament and say, oh, well, God can use, if he spoke to them back then, he can speak to us now through this text. And they don't care about context at all. The other major thing I want to say, and that is this issue of prophecy. Fact is, I'm not being mean, but in the church, no one understands what this means because they've been told all their lives that prophecy equals telling the future. But in the biblical concept, that's not true. It's more like telling the truth. It means to tell, be an oral mouthpiece for God. The Greek word prophecies is where we get the word prophet. It's navi in Hebrew. It means spokesperson or oracle or mouthpiece. That's all that means. And it's been estimated between 3 to 5% tops of Old Testament text are actually genuinely about the distant future. Almost everything a prophet talks about is about the present and their time, a contemporaneous present issue, or an issue that's just about to happen, the very, very near future. Because its idea is that it's a word from God to them to change something or to be encouraged right then and there. And every once in a while, they'll say, God gave me a message to you people that in the future. But it's like 97% of the time that's not true. It's a word from the Lord for the current situation. A word from the Lord, current situation. So, okay, that's how it is. That's just how it is. But the Jews, back to my first point, but these are different points, but they're related. Since Jews didn't have a problem saying, well, if God spoke through the prophets to their current situation back then, he can speak to those prophets that are on print, on the scroll. They can speak to us now. And if he can speak to us now, it's like he's speaking to us now all over again, which means it's being fulfilled all over again. It's being fulfilled. God's living word, as it were, is being fulfilled right now in our midst. And so they had no problem believing that quote, prophecy, meaning the word from the Lord about that current situation, is also being fulfilled right now. So if I interviewed Matthew, if I could time travel and ask the gospel writer, whoever wrote it, and I'll say Matthew, that's fine. If Matthew, let me ask you a question, Matthew. When you said, this is to fulfill, like in Jeremiah. So let's go to Matthew chapter 2. I'm looking over Matthew's gospel with Matthew. I say, Matthew, I notice here in chapter 2, 17, 18, you quote Jeremiah 31:15, and you say this is to the fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:15. Matthew, does that mean you think Jeremiah 31:15 wasn't fulfilled when Jeremiah wrote it? And it's just now being fulfilled? Or not? Or do you think it's being fulfilled again? My response to that is, Matthew doesn't tell us what he would say. He doesn't tell us what he'd say. I think most New Testament scholars would say, Matthew would probably say both. Now, I find that pretty persuasive because I don't think Matthew's a dummy. I think that when he reads these texts, a lot of them, he knows us what happened. For example, in the same Matthew, when you said you shall call him Emmanuel, and you're quoting from Isaiah, and you said this is to fulfill that prophecy, do you really think in Isaiah's time, when Isaiah was speaking about a child, probably his own child, that was not fulfilled in the time period? I don't think Matthew would say, oh, no, it was never fulfilled. I think he would say, yeah, it was fulfilled. But God spoke to them in that moment, and he's speaking to us now. So what I find most persuasive, when I see the expression, to fulfill the prophecy of blank, I think it's like the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and Paul. It's like they're saying, here's an analogy. It's like this. It's like the time when Jeremiah said blank. Now, the early church would disagree with me. The Jews would disagree with me. They would say, no, David, it's not just analogical. It's not just an analogy. It's not just like the time. It is just like that time. I mean, it's happening all over again. So in Isaiah 7, when it says that you shall call his name Emmanuel, because that child being born is representative of God the Father rescuing people, it is just like that right now with the birth of Jesus. I think that's what they would say to me. I think so. I don't think that's, I just disagree. I think they're using the text more like an analogy. It's like that time when Jeremiah said, "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children." It's like that text is coming true all over again. It's like that text is coming true all over again. That's the way I read those texts most of the time. Most of the time. Again, I don't know for sure. I might be wrong. Matthew might really have thought Jeremiah 31:15 was never fulfilled, and we were waiting for centuries for it to be fulfilled, and finally now it is, with Jesus and Herod and so forth. Maybe so. Maybe so. So that's why, I'm sorry to always be nuanced here a little bit, but when you say, I feel a lot like what I read in the Gospels that are fulfillment of prophecy aren't really prophecies about the Messiah, my response is yes and no. It all depends on how you understand prophecy and how you understand the fulfillment of prophecy. And scholars do not concur on exactly how to understand that. What they concur with is the point's already made. They concur that they don't care about context because it's God's living word, as it were, and he can speak whenever he wants to, and they're going to go through it to understand the current situation. And two, those prophecies aren't always prophecies about the future, but it's much more of a sense of God has spoken to them in that moment. And they can, that's the issue. The third quick thing I want to say is, you said about the Messiah. And that's absolutely a good astute observation, because most Old Testament texts do not speak about the Messiah to most ancient Jews. I remember being very surprised when I learned this. I heard all my life, from people, well-intentioned people. I don't understand it. I don't understand why those Jews didn't understand Jesus. Why in the world didn't they all believe? They had their Bible. God had all these prophecies, and they'd all been clearly fulfilled in his time. They're just so dim-witted or stupid or something. Until you go and read ancient Jewish literature. Very, very few texts that the earliest Jewish Christians said were messianic were actually considered to be messianic by other Jews. It's like saying the Jews weren't looking that direction. They weren't looking at those texts and saying, these are clearly messianic texts. We know that because we don't know what every single Jew was thinking. But we knew what a lot of interpreters were thinking because we can read their ancient Bible commentaries. We have several of them. We don't have all of them. We have several of them. You can read commentaries on Numbers and Deuteronomy and Exodus. You can read what they were thinking about these texts and then compare it to how the earliest Christians wrote about those texts. It's surprising how different they are. And they are different. For example, in in the book, letter of Romans, the Apostle Paul makes a lot, like in Romans chapter 4 and other passages, and in Galatians 2, about Abraham just trusting, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He just had faith. It was reckoned to him as righteousness. And Paul's whole point of using that text from Genesis 12 is that Abraham did not need to do anything. He just needed to believe in God's promises. And Paul's point, it's just like that with Jesus. You don't have to earn it or do anything. You just have to believe in Jesus. That's against his Jewish opponents. What's so amazing and so bizarre is we have what other Jews were saying about the Abraham passage in Genesis, and none of them would have agreed with Paul. None of them, from the evidence we have. That is to say, when Paul gave that sermon at the synagogue, I'm being a little silly here. You dumb Jews, haven't you read Genesis before? Look at what it says. Abraham believed in his righteousness. The Jews would have been ticked off. Their response would have been debate. They would have responded to Paul. They would have said, Paul, dummy. The reason why I was reckoning that he believed, sure, but he believed and he demonstrated that belief by offering up his son. It was his obedience that demonstrated his faith, and it's his obedience that made him righteous, not just believing something, but his obedience to doing something. Every single Jewish commentary we have of the time period reads it that way. And that's one of many examples I could give you where Jews did not read, the average Jew didn't read what would become later messianic texts the way they didn't agree. They just disagreed on how to read the Bible. And New Testament scholars have noticed this for a long time. And they say, well, why is it? Why is it these earliest Jewish Christians go back to these texts and say, this had to have happened from the Messiah. These suffering servants, it had to have been that way. Why is it? And basically everyone concurs. I shouldn't say everyone. That's a scary word. The standard New Testament view amongst scholars is Jesus. What we call in scholarship the Christ event. the ministry, the death, and resurrection, ascension of Jesus. That is, Jesus became such a fundamental, overwhelmingly groundbreaking way of understanding reality. They went back to their Bible, as all Jews did, and tried to make sense of their experience, not the other way around. And when they had that experience and looked back on the whole time, they go, oh, it was there all along. We see this exactly in Luke chapter 24, and the disciples going to the walk of Emmaus, and Jesus comes up and says, what you all depressed about? And he says, are you the only person who's ignorant about what's going on? No, tell me all about it. We thought this guy was going to restore Israel. We thought he was. And it says Jesus had to lead them through the prophets and scriptures to say it was necessary that the Messiah suffer. Every New Testament scholar that I've ever read concurs. That is Luke's way of saying this is a real pressing issue for our churches. Jewish believers who are on the fence or they're converting to Christianity, this is very difficult for them. How in the world is it that God's Messiah would suffer? And these earliest Jewish Christians came up with a bunch of texts from the Old Testament, a bunch of them that were the standard go-to verses to prove their point. That the experience was justified because, these texts have been here all along. And a list of those scriptures we tend to call testimonia, a list of these Old Testament texts that demonstrate this narrative of this experience of Jesus. So that's the last thing. When you say they're not prophecies about the Messiah, my response is it's probably true and false. If you ask a modern day Jew or an ancient Jew, is Isaiah 53 about Jesus? Is Jeremiah 31 and really about, and then Matthew 2, is that really this voice crying out in the wilderness, the Ramah, Rachel weeping for, is that really about Jesus? Every single Jew today is going to say, no, it's not about Jesus. No, it's not. It's about Babylonian captivity. But Christians are going to say, well, yeah, it was. And we're going to just, there we go. We disagree about biblical interpretation. And the Christian response is, well, if a Jew said, why do you read it that way? They did that to Paul. There's no doubt they did that to Paul and the earliest Christians all the time. All the time. They would look at Paul and say, Paul, have you ever read your Bible? Cursed is the one who hangs on the tree. Have you read Deuteronomy 21? And Paul says, absolutely, I've read it. That really was about Jesus because it says, yeah, that's right. He's cursed. He became our curse. He became our curse. That's the main point he makes in Galatians. So Paul had a difficult exegetical job, interpretive job of convincing his fellow Jews that they need to read their Bible differently. And today it's the exact same thing. It's just the same thing. You've asked the average Jew today about messianic prophecies. If you line them up, some would align with New Testament stuff. Some would, but the vast majority probably would not. And they would read these texts and go, these are clearly prophetic. And we would say, clearly they're not. And they would say, what makes you think clearly they're not? And I would say, because they don't apply to Jesus. And they would say, we don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And we're going to say, why not? They're going to say, because he didn't fulfill these other verses. That's the circle. And we'll say, Jesus didn't fulfill those verses because those verses aren't messianic. And they're going to say, why do you think they're not messianic? And we're going to say, because they're not about Jesus. And they're going to say, of course it's not about Jesus. It's about the Messiah. Jesus can't be the Messiah because he didn't fulfill these verses. You see the circle over and over and over? And that's almost certainly what happened in the earliest primitive church. And that's why most scholars concur. What made these earliest Jewish Christians change sides was not biblical interpretation. It was the actual experience. They really did think Jesus really was the God-man. He was God the Father's viceroy on earth, and that he really was resurrected. And it really seems to have been the case that they saw him alive after death, not in the heavenly realm like a vision, but he ate fish. He was alive and well. And they had to say, well, now what do we do? Because our biblical interpretation now has to fit the experience we've had. And we got to do that well. And that's almost certainly what happened. So I've said a mouthful probably too quickly. I'm sorry if it was, Jared. But these are good questions, good stuff. If you have more questions or comments or agreements, disagreement, let me know, brother. And I'll do my best to help you out. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. @Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, Dr. D. Pendergrass, or @Glimpse the King, @Glimpse the King. and I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.